So hi everyone, welcome to Accessibility Week for the CS Colloquium. We're going to have 4 talks and we're running short on time, so we're actually going to hold questions to the end of all 4 talks, which is a lie from what I told you guys earlier. Sorry, speakers. You can put any questions that you have in the chat and I will do my best to keep track of them so we can answer them in the correct order, but questions are likely going to go over. So without further ado, I'm going to ask that DJ can go ahead and start presenting. DJ is going to be presenting his work on SoundWatch, exploring smartwatch-based deep learning to support sound awareness for deaf and hard of hearing users.
Hello everyone, I'm DJ. I'm presenting my work that was submitted to the ATHOT conference this year, and it's on the smartwatch-based deep learning approaches for sound awareness. Let me just start with a brief introduction. Sound recognition is at the heart of the many modern AI systems used for home surveillance, appliance repairs, and accessibility. And in terms of accessibility, for example, our own past work, Hometown, investigated the sound classification for our accessibility application, that is to support DHH users in the home. However, while the watch was used as a feedback device, as with most prior work, the sentiment classification was done on non-portable devices. And with the recent shift in AI towards mobile optimized models, it makes sense to explore sound classification for mobile and wearable devices as well. Indeed, the recent release iOS 14 has incorporated sound recognition into the consumer smartphone, but its release is closed source and the implementation and the evaluation details are not known. So in this work, we performed 2 studies. One, a quantitative examination of 4 lightweight deep learning models to classify sound on low resource devices, and a qualitative evaluation of a smartwatch-based sound awareness app called SoundWatch with 8 DHH participants. So a recent study with 201 DHH users showed that the smartwatch was the most preferred device, even more than smartphone for sound feedback. That is why we prefer to use a smartwatch. Let's go to the study in turn. Like study 1. The goal of the first study was to conduct a performance evaluation of 4 deep learning sound classification models across 4 device architectures. So we downloaded 3 lightweight image classification models for smaller devices. So these models were recently released in January 2020 and include MobileNet, Inception, and ResNet. We also used a quantized version of the model from a previous Hometown work, which we called a VGG Lite. To compare with prior approaches in sound classification, we also compared a model with a full VGG model for non-portable devices that was running on a laptop. In terms of architectures, 4 architectures were examined: watch only, watch plus phone, watch plus cloud, and watch plus phone plus cloud. And for all our experiments, we used a commercially available smartwatch and a smartphone. So let's quickly discuss what we found. While direct comparison to past work is challenging, we found that the best classification model performs similarly to the state of the art for non-portable devices while requiring a substantially less memory. More specifically, the accuracy of our best model was 81.2% for 20 sound classes and 97% for the 3 highest priority classes when evaluated on a data set of sound recordings from the field. Among the 4 models, we observed a strict accuracy latency trade-off. That is, the most accurate model was also the slowest. In terms of the architecture, we found that the 2 phone-based architectures outperform the watch-centric design in terms of CPU, memory, battery usage, and the end-to-end latency. To complement these quantitative findings, we built and conducted a qualitative lab evaluation of a smartwatch-based sound awareness app called SoundWatch with 8 DHH participants. Before describing the study, let me go give a brief description of the SoundWatch. So SoundWatch is an Android-based app designed for commercially available smartwatches that inform the user about 3 key sound properties: sound identity, loudness, and the time of occurrence through customizable sound alerts using visual and vibration feedback. Soundbot offers support for 4 device architectures with the deep learning model running on either the watch, the phone, or the cloud. We designed the content pipeline to protect user privacy. Specifically, Soundbot processes the sound locally on the watch or the phone, and in the case of a cloud-based architecture, only upload the non-reconstructible mail spectrogram features. Now let me describe its evaluation, that is the study 2. The goal of the study 2 was to gather user feedback on our system results and the Soundbot app. We recruited 8 DHS participants, 3 women, 3 men, and 2 non-binary. The procedure included a campus walkthrough with the Soundbot app and 3 contents, a lawn, a lounge, a lab, and a bus stop. And after the walk, we performed an interview on the experience and other technical considerations, such as the desired accuracy latency trade-off for deep learning models, and thoughts related to privacy and resource consumption for the 4 possible Soundbot architectures: watch only, watch plus phone, watch plus cloud, and watch plus phone plus cloud. We found that all participants generally appreciated Soundbot across all 3 contexts, reaffirming past Soundbot network. However, we also observed several misclassifications, especially in the outdoor environment due to the background noise. For accuracy latency trade-off, participants wanted minimum delay for urgent sound, such as the car honk, in order for them to take any required action, and they wanted maximum accuracy for non-urgent sound, example a speech, to not be unnecessarily disturbed. Finally, participants selected watch plus phone as the most preferred architecture because compared to the cloud-based architecture, it was more private and versatile, it required no internet connection, and compared to the watch only, it was faster. In reflection, I want to come back to a research question. How well does a smartwatch-based sound classification tool need to perform to provide value? Our findings show that this is a complex question that needs further study. One way to explore is to release Soundwatch to the public, much like what Apple did with the iOS 14, and study the actual users. However, this approach also introduces ethical concerns. Let's say the user private data is recorded, and also safety concerns. For example, let's say the app fails to recognize a critical sound, such as the fire alarm. What would the user do that? But increasing transparency by allowing the user to view their collected sound data and by letting them know that the app could fail at any point may help. Another idea to increase the perceived accuracy is to explore showing multiple possible sounds. For example, if the system fails to differentiate between a microwave or a dishwasher, why not just show the possibility of both instead of showing the most probable sound as in a design? We can also explore end-user customization. While installing the app, each user could select the desired sound that they want, and the app would dynamically fine-tune the model in the field. And finally, FutureWorks could give the option for the participant to train their own sound, much like what some people at CMU did. Of course, this training may be tedious and difficult if the sound itself is inaccessible to people who are deaf and hard of hearing. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that SmartWatch offers a myriad of possibilities for DHS users and beyond. And please refer to that paper for more interesting ideas to explore on SmartWatch and sound feedback. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, DJ, for that excellent presentation. Again, I'm going to ask if you have any questions. Yes, applause. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. We're going to answer them all later. You can save it for later, whatever floats your boat. Our next presentation is going to be about studying the disabled experience within CSE, Autoethnographic Disability Research at Assets 2020. So we're actually going to have 2 people co-presenting. Megan Hoffman is going to be talking about her paper, Living Disability Theory, Reflections on Access, Research, and Design. And Venkatesh Potluri is going to be talking about an ethnography that he was a part of, which is Navigating Graduate School with a Disability.
Thanks, Kelly. So my name is Megan Hoffman. I'm a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University.
I'm Venkatesh Potluri, and I'm a PhD student here at UW-CSE.
And I wanted to start off with kind of an exploration of what autoethnography is. Autoethnography is a formal self-examination of a scholar's personal experiences which are relevant to the field. It's usually done by members of understudied populations, in our case, disabled people, and this enables us to provide unique insights into the field. Actually, DJ, our last presenter, was one of the first people to present an autoethnography at Assets in 2019, an autoethnography of a hard of hearing traveler. And as Kelly mentioned, we'll be presenting on both of our papers today and kind of the overlap between them, between living disability theory and navigating graduate school with a disability. One of the first themes of my paper was the analysis of disability beyond diagnosis. I have an obscure fainting disorder which hasn't been fully diagnosed by doctors even after more than 10 years of working with doctors. And this shows that not all disabled people actually have access to a diagnosis. Disability instead is an identity and a social experience. But often when we create assistive technology, diagnosis is used to define the user's experience. We show an icon here of a smartwatch with a heartbeat signal running across it to represent all of the times I've had researchers come to me who are studying different types of sensing technology to apply it to my disability, but are frustrated when they can't find a model that applies well because there's not existing data which is connected to diagnosis. This means that the technology is not accessible to me and I can't be of service to the research community. Another example that showed up in both of our papers was the theme of connecting disabled people. I show an image here of a person sitting in a wheelchair, a person with a mobility cane, and a blind user with a white cane all interacting with each other to represent that disability is a shared experience and disabled people connect with each other quite often. We have a bunch of disabled authors presenting in this talk right now. But this often creates access conflicts which occur when disabled people interact with each other. Venkatesh shows a great example of this.
Thanks, Megan. Continuing on what Megan said about access conflicts, I'd like to give an example from my trio ethnography with DJ and Ather. To accommodate DJ in an accessibility seminar, the seminar organizer and him came up with a turn-taking strategy to use a talking pillow to make conversations more inclusive. He notes, I met the professor before the accessibility seminar. I told her that captioning does not always work for a group discussion and asked to discuss alternate ways of increasing access. Specifically, I said, delay in captioning makes it hard to follow the speaker transitions. Delay in captioning makes it hard for me to join the conversation since I don't know when speaker pauses are made, and asked to discuss alternate ways of increasing access. So we discussed for a bit and decided to use the talking pillow approach for our accessibility seminar, where we will use an object like a softball or a pen, and the person possessing the pillow is allowed to talk. This approach made so much difference. The pillow allowed me to visually notice who is speaking, when speaker transitions occurred, prompted people to make pauses between conversations because pillow passing takes time, and gave a visual indicator that a deaf or hard of hearing person was present in the group, constantly reminding everybody to talk slowly and face towards me. I was able to follow speakers and also more deeply share my ideas and contribute to the conversations. I felt belonged, included, and productive. It was great that I helped shape some discussions. However, all these visual cues, while making the seminar accessible to DJ, were inaccessible to me. At that time, I reflected and noted, while the pillow was really necessary for DJ, it was causing somewhat of an access barrier for me. I wasn't sure how and when to ask for the pillow as I couldn't see it being circulated around. Moreover, for the first few days, I felt intimidated to ask for the pillow because I felt that the comment that I'd have to make after getting the pillow would have to be a good one, worthy of the attention from everybody. However, I eventually got over it because it was the accessibility seminar, a place that makes me comfortable with my disability. Many people missed catching the glove as it was being thrown around. So this became this funny thing where people would laugh if anybody, including me, missed catching the glove. To be honest, I enjoyed the challenge of catching the glove like everybody else. Beyond presence of multiple disabilities, other factors caused inaccessibility in the graduate school experience. Analyzing experiences from DJ, Ather, and I revealed 4 factors that played a part in access. They are self-image, relationships, technology, and infrastructure. In the interest of time, I'll talk of one of these factors, which is infrastructure. We notice tensions in asking for accommodations due to infrastructure considerations, specifically when it is unclear on who bears the burden of responsibility of access. For example, it was easy to get access when the access responsibility was clear. I was getting coffee from the CSE kitchen one day, and someone from facilities was noticing me. She asked, "We want to make sure you're comfortable using the facilities here." That was followed by a 5-minute chat about the things that I need. Things being consistently placed at the same location and braille labels to help identify the coffee. About an hour later, she got back to me, telling that the facilities team has already ordered a braille label. I had an access barrier, and they were solving it. Never did I get asked, "How do we do this?" 2 days later, I was getting coffee, and I put my hands around the coffee pot, and I found the braille labels. My joy had no bounds. No more tasting tiny quantities of coffee and guessing if this is the coffee I want to drink. This increased access, however, was not easy when I tried the same approach for another cafe due to potential lack of clarity on whose responsibility it is to make it accessible. Excited from the above experience, I sent an email to the facility member asking if the department cafe could make their menus accessible. She said sure, but nothing happened. I was sad at her. But I later found out that the cafe is owned by a parent body, and she might have reached out to them and got no response. And I didn't know how to contact the parent body and whether they'll solve this because the cafe is located inside the department. Next slide. Our situational and longitudinal experiences show how inaccessibility really occurs in the details. We found that careful planning and care increase the quality of access. However, we also found that there could be situations when, despite all planning, misaccommodations might occur. For these situations, we offer some strategies which we term uncharted accommodations. We present 4 ways of implementing uncharted accommodations very briefly. They are proactive customization, effective collaboration, community participation, and repurposing technologies. Please read our paper to learn more about the other factors that played a part in access that we didn't get to talk about, and to learn about strategies to implement uncharted accommodations. Megan will now talk about a few takeaways from all of this.
Thanks, Venkatesh. So I really want to spotlight here that a bunch of UW students have really pioneered new methodologies in accessibility research based off of their own disabilities. And we ask you as researchers to consider disability in more diverse ways. We really expect people to look for research opportunities where disabled people interact with each other, because this tends to be underexplored in accessibility research. And as educators, we ask that folks understand their students' highly personalized access needs and create an atmosphere of accommodation requests by planning ahead for accommodations and accessibility rather than leaving it up to uncharted accommodations. Thank you so much. I guess we'll have questions at the end, but we also have email addresses on this slide if folks want to reach out to us.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan and Venkatesh. Thank you for sharing those very personal experiences with us. I'm really hopeful and excited to see this trend of more ethnographic research at Assets continue. Next up, we are going to have Nick Bolton present on his project Walkability, when sidewalk data is a novelty, interactive, inclusive, city-scaled analyses of pedestrian access through the Open Sidewalk project. So, Nick, you can go ahead and present.
So, hello everyone, my name is Nick Bolton, and I'm a postdoc with Dr. Anat Kespi at the Tesker Center for Accessible Technology. Today I'm going to be sharing some work that we did, titled, of course, Walkability, when sidewalk data is a novelty, inclusive, interactive, inclusive, city-scale analyses of pedestrian access through the Open Sidewalks project. So it's a lot of words, but fundamentally a lot of the questions that we ask are just about, can I get to a certain location from here? Individuals want to know this, and a lot of agencies and companies also want to know this, but it gets reframed in more and more complex ways. And it needs to be framed in terms of disabilities or other individualistic kind of experiences or mobility concerns. So that makes it difficult to answer. So for example, here we can see an agency's publication, this is Sound Transit, of areas served by a bus line. In this particular case, we're looking at analysis of related bus lines that connect Seattle to the east side and beyond. Now, one thing that should potentially jump out at you is that these are all circles. So these are circles centered around bus stops, taking up very large amounts of space. We can see that they include large bodies of water, as well as just things that don't seem practical. So why is this? Why is it that Town Transit claims that a bus line serves half of Lake Washington? The answer is because they're completely ignoring urban form, as well as diversity and pedestrian mobility. So rather than specifically analyzing how pedestrians can get around in an urban space, they simply decided on a radius of service and put it down on the map. This implies a lot of silly things, like pedestrians swimming to destinations or walking through buildings, and of course, it's also highly inaccurate. Now here we can look at a more sophisticated example. This is one showing calculating a multimodal service area, similar idea, this time from the company Conveyal, also for the city of Seattle. This has no more circles. Instead, we see kind of more organic blobs showing spaces around bus stops that could potentially be served by pedestrians, or could potentially serve pedestrians. However, it still has some fundamental problems that I'm going to talk about that have to do with limited data and analytic methods. So, for example, they're assuming that all pedestrians can and will use virtually any street, aside from potentially highways. So they don't know really any information about the pedestrian experience. They haven't modeled pedestrian diversity in any way. They've just said, if there's a street and it's not a highway, you can move on it for a certain amount of distance. So by overlooking these individual strong preferences, they have, of course, not modeled accessibility very well. Now, the examples I just showed are not actually particularly egregious outliers. They're kind of almost closer to the gold standard so far as this kind of discussion goes in the mainstream. So why are pedestrian analyses like this? So one reason is that there's just no data available most of the time for specific pedestrian experiences. So even basic information like, are there sidewalks, or where can I cross the street? Is it a marked crossing? And that sort of thing is typically just not available at all in the first place. And furthermore, when data does exist, it's extremely non-standardized. Sometimes they're presented as linear data that's published in some kind of open data source. Sometimes they're just metadata that's been added to the street. Sometimes we have polygonal data where surfaces might be, and those polygons can have very diverse representations. And as a consequence of all this, there are no widespread or standardized models for describing pedestrian movement. There's in diversity in terms of how pedestrians navigate their environments, but those models have not been elucidated. The Open Sidewalks project focuses on kind of tackling a lot of these fundamental problems from the ground up. So we define a standard for describing pedestrian network data. So rather than using streets, we can say these are the actual places you can go as a pedestrian. This involves defining this very specific network that describes the primary ways of getting around. So that could be sidewalks, it could be crossings, it could be pedestrian friendly streets, as well as potential conditional barriers and other amenities that might be useful for a given pedestrian. This could include curbs that have been raised or curb ramps. This could include the width of the sidewalk or street furniture that might be impactful. In addition to defining that standard, we actually go out and attempt to collect or convert existing data into this format and then republish it and make use of it, both for user-facing tools as well as for analysis. So here I'm showing 3 cities, kind of an overhead view of 3 cities, Bellingham, Mount Vernon, and Seattle in the state of Washington. And we've mapped out, either ourselves or with partners, the entirety of these cities for their sidewalks and crossings, as well as a lot of metadata about them. And some of our collaborators in the OpenStreetMap community have mapped out all of San Jose region, which I'm also showing here. Now, once we actually have data that's of this format, we can start to use it to do much more appropriate questions. So rather than ask as the crow flies, which is that example earlier showing circles on the map, or street-based analysis like that Conveyal map showed, we can very specifically traverse a more realistic pedestrian network according to a specified pedestrian's needs. So over here on the very right panel in the upper right, we can see a very simple pedestrian mobility profile, which we call a cost function in this case. It's used to evaluate every single element of the pedestrian network and to produce some kind of metric of traversability. In this case, it's just whether it can be used and how difficult it is to move along. This is then used to simulate those real-world experiences and traverse the network. From this, we can do a lot of sophisticated analysis having to do with measuring accessibility. In this case, we've modeled a stereotyped manual wheelchair user who requires curb ramps across the street and cannot handle inclines greater than 8.3%. As you can see, the resulting service area on the very right here is actually quite different for this individual compared to the street network analysis. The entire upper right quadrant is actually now missing because this is an area that has poor curb ramps as well as steep hills. We can then take this kind of analysis that was done for an individual location and scale it up to the entire city. So here I'm showing, again, kind of a more asset by asset based view that's showing all the cities and downtown, all the streets, all the sidewalks in downtown Seattle. And what we're doing is looking at per sidewalk, how do we evaluate the accessibility? Here we're looking at a normative walking profile. So this is a profile that hasn't stated any specific requirements and assumes that there's no known future barriers in the city. So as a result, we get kind of an all gold view. If we then restrict our profile a little bit, this time we're using, again, a stereotyped manual wheelchair profile, but of course this could be any individual requirement stated about inclines or curb ramps or sidewalks, any of these kinds of things. We see many paths have now disappeared. These have become black, and these are no longer accessible according to this individual. Furthermore, we can combine this with requirements that might not just be specific physical requirements, but have to do with conditional or personal preferences. So in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, the desire to have at least 6 feet between you and someone else is a potential interest for somebody trying to travel downtown. So we can, again, reinterpret the network and say, I want to avoid all sidewalks or indoor spaces where I would have less than 6 feet between me and a pedestrian guaranteed. I wouldn't be able to avoid them if the sidewalk is too narrow. In addition, we can start to get more sophisticated in how we look at this network. So in this case, I'm comparing, again, those 2 reachable areas for pedestrians versus individuals using the streets. And we can actually say, how would we metricize this? How would we say how easy it is to get around an area? So in this case, we've proposed an example that we call sidewalk score. And all that means is that we've taken the area you can reach as an individual pedestrian with very specific requirements you've stated for yourself, versus what could you theoretically reach if there were good infrastructure available. So this normalized score gives us back a number, where 0 would mean you have very, very poor access as a pedestrian to this infrastructure. A value of 1 would mean you have just as good of access as you could possibly expect based on the urban form that's currently available. So we can go back to that same view of the map and see that now we have a lot of network effects adding nuance. So this is displaying the normative walking profile again. This is someone who has not stated any particular requirements, but now we see a lot more nuance and information in this map. So a light yellow color, which you can see towards the center of the map, is showing a very good score. But as you move away from there, you tend to get much worse scores as we get towards the waterfront or the barrier of I-5. So we see a lot of variation in these scores and colors consequently. In addition, when we again go back to our stereotyped manual wheelchair profile, we see a dramatic difference. So whereas before all we saw were a few of the steepest sidewalks cut out from our analysis, now we can really see the network effects kicking in. The center core, which was previously bright yellow for individuals with no stated mobility requirements, has now become probably the worst place on the map for an individual wheelchair user. And that's because of these network effects. You just can't get to that many spaces because all of your northeast corridors have been shut down. Furthermore, we can do an individual dive into why we're getting these scores. We can ask actually sidewalk score questions of any space in the entire network and see why would we be getting a poor score. So we can ask, what is the actual area we're reaching? Which areas were we not able to get to? In addition, this is just one example of many that we could use to analyze the pedestrian network, to ask questions of equity and access, and frame it in many different aspects. This is kind of a fundamental data layer and approach that we can apply to a lot of different situations. So here we're showing the number of times that a particular class of amenity, in the upper half it would be schools, can be reached from any point in Seattle between 2 different stereotyped pedestrian profiles, again the same ones from before. We're displaying a map here, and we're showing where where there's pink color can be reached. Where there's pink color, they can reach a school, and the color gets darker the larger number of schools that can be reached. By comparing the 2 maps, we can see that the splotches differ from one another. There's a much smaller reachable area for individuals who have a stated requirement that lines up with kind of a stereotypical manual wheelchair user. And then we can use this to drive questions of equity. So by comparing specific pedestrian experiences and abilities across access to services and locations, we can begin to explore pedestrian equity in a much more specific way that is usually possible without detailed network information. So thank you, everyone. I guess we're going to keep questions till the end, but you can contact us here if you want to get in touch. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. It's really great to see the impact that you and your group has on the local Seattle community. This is really cool work. Last but not least, we are going to have Manaswi Saha. She's going to present her CSCW paper titled Urban Accessibility as a Socio-Political Problem, a Multi-Stakeholder Analysis. Go ahead, Manaswi, whenever you're ready.
Hello, everyone. I'm Manaswi. I'm a PhD student in the Makeability Lab, which is led by John Freilich. So as Kelly mentioned, today I'll present our work on urban accessibility, looking at it from a socio-political perspective by using a multi-stakeholder approach. So this is a CSCW work, which is coming up in 2 weeks, done in collaboration with Jeff Hare and a couple of HCDE master's students. So since we talked a lot about sidewalks, let's think a little bit more. So take a moment and think about the crucial role it plays in your life, right? And now think about all of the times you've had issues walking or rolling on a sidewalk. You could probably think of situations where you almost tripped over a heavily heaved sidewalk, maybe caused due to a tree root uprooting the sidewalk or a completely broken sidewalk. Now these issues, however, disproportionately affect people with mobility disabilities like wheelchair users or cane users. So why are sidewalks inaccessible? What leads to this inaccessibility? And who is responsible for the repairs? Turns out it's not a simple answer. It depends. So urban accessibility is a combination of many stakeholders taking decisions at different stages, and that's where the problem arises. So in this talk, we will uncover these invisible socio-political challenges to accessible infrastructure development. Now, to understand this socio-political perspective, let's look at some of these definitions of urban accessibility, which makes the problem complicated. So urban accessibility is studied across different fields, including urban planning and transportation, human geography, disability studies, and urban sociology. Within these fields, traditionally, accessibility is defined as the interactions between humans and land. And more specifically, it's the ease or difficulty for people to reach opportunities and services. So this is the definitions that were defined like in the 60s in the urban planning and transportation field. Now, mobility is also strongly associated with accessibility, which essentially looks at proximity to destinations and how quickly you can get there. So, which is why you rely on trip rates. Now, both of these do not look at the differences in physical and mobility challenges across while moving around. So disability looks at the product of dynamic interaction of the human and environment. Going a little bit more further, the socio-political model of disability shifts the focus from the individual to the broader social, cultural, economical, and political environment. And that's what we are trying to understand through this work. Now, we asked two big questions. What is the socio-political context of urban accessibility? And how do we enable change within this context? And by change, in this case, we mean facilitate accessible infrastructure development by providing physical access. To study these questions, we did an interview study with 25 participants across 3 cities on both coasts. With 5 stakeholder groups. So we asked questions around their assessment approaches around accessibility and their decision-making practices. Now, we had 5 stakeholder groups. So MI individuals, caregivers, advocates, government officials, which included policymakers such as elected officials, and department officials such as Department of Transportation. Now, each of these stakeholders have their own perspectives. For example, MI individuals and caregivers cared more about their safety, the quality of physical access, and the freedom to move around. Advocates, on the other hand, fought for their people in need, for their rights, and they want to change the status quo. So for doing that, they work with both the citizens as well as the governments. And on the government side, policymakers are responsible for developing laws and policies. They prioritize, distribute resources, and manage these competing issues that occur at the city level. On the other side are department officials, which execute these said policies and make accessibility improvements. So they do the actual groundwork of repairing. But that's only part of the whole picture. Now, given these perspectives, we saw different types of practices that went into how they assessed using data and technology, what decision-making practices they did for accessible infrastructure development at the city scale, what were the interactions between the stakeholders, and what were the challenges. So in the interest of time, I'll be focusing only on the interactions and the challenges portion. Now, at the city scale level, significant interactions occur between three main groups, which are the policymakers, department officials, and advocates. Now, each of these stakeholders have different roles to play. And in the decision-making workflow, their roles interact differently depending on what the decision is being made. But they all come together for two main goals. One is setting city agendas and priorities, and second is prioritizing investments. Now, in this decision-making process, there were several social, political, and economical challenges noticed. So some of these include lack of political will, lack of public interest, conflicting responsibilities and priorities, inconsistent accessibility regulations across organizations, and insufficient funding. So I'll talk about the top three to see how those interact with each other. Lack of political will is essentially if a politician is not interested in the issue, so it never becomes a real focus of committee, in this case, the transportation committee. On the other hand, public disinterest can reduce the number of voices who can then go forward and advocate for the needs. Now, what happens at the end is how they interact with each other, which is public interest strongly influences political will. So this was nicely quoted by this policymaker who said, at the end of the day, it becomes a political discussion of how much money do we think the citizens are willing to vote for. At the end of the day, it's going to be the 9 council members and the mayor deciding, here's what we think the population will bear. And it becomes more of a political discussion and less of a policy. So as you can see, there are these different socio-political challenges which are hard to solve at one level. So how do we understand where technology can play a role? How do we enable change in this space? So what we realized is that several of these socio-political challenges are tied to the communication gaps or lack of interactions between the stakeholder groups. So to understand this a little better, we mapped out all of these interactions across the stakeholder groups in a thing called civic interaction space, which visualizes the similarities as well as differences of interactions between the stakeholders. So for example, as you can see here, raising awareness occurs multiple times between the stakeholders, but the context in which it occurs is very different. So the technology, if you're introducing, would have to adapt to these differences in context. In the paper, we focus on 2 areas, specifically improving community input and government feedback and supporting advocacy efforts. In the first one, we noticed that there is less of government feedback coming back to the citizens and more of citizen feedback going into the government. So there's a lack of closing the feedback loop. And then in the second one, we see that advocates have enough interactions going on with the government. It's the process in which it happens and the lack of resources to help them achieve the effective communication such that it leads to effective decision making. So I would encourage everyone to refer to the paper for more details in the interest of time and where technology can sort of play a role in this space. So with that, I will end my talk, thanking my team without whom we could not have made it. And with that, I think we can do questions now.
Yes, thank you so much, Manaswi. It's so great to see both you and Nick doing work on sidewalks, which is so critical to our infrastructure. Let's give a round of applause or the little clap emoji for all of our participants or all of our speakers. They did phenomenal. This was such a great seminar. I really liked it. There was one from the chat that I'll voice to start. So Leah had asked Megan As somebody with an undiagnosed disability, do you have thoughts about finding community without a diagnosis? Have you ever felt like an imposter in a disability community because you don't have a diagnosis and others in the community did? Do you have any suggestions for how to get through this kind of situation?
Actually, a really great question. And I'll answer kind of the second one first. I do have a lot of experiences of feeling not quite like I'm disabled enough. And we talk about this in depth in the paper. So I'll refer to you for that. In terms of finding people without diagnosis, I wouldn't actually recommend that you go and seek out folks necessarily who don't have an existing diagnosis. I would just not require it when you're doing your research and consider that as representing a larger population. So in the example of working with people who are developing sensing technologies, I'm also often excluded from work on creating sensing technologies because they can't compare it to any other model or they don't know how to kind of work with it. And I really encourage researchers to, if you encounter someone like that, which is probably more common than you might think, to just go forward, push forward with the work and try and adapt to their needs and take that on as a challenging research problem in its own right.
Thank you, Megan. So our speakers have actually answered the 2 outstanding chat questions in the chat. So does anybody wants to type hand or just unmute and ask a question?
I have a rather practical question.
Go ahead, Christoph.
How do I get involved in open sidewalks if I guess, like, supposing either I want data about sidewalks or I would like to, report issues?
Oh, cool. That's a very good question, and one that we're working to make it easier to answer.
I would like to complain about some sidewalks I would like to complain about 55th Street, please. Someone's probably already done it, but I'd like to do it again.
Yep. There's all kinds of problems. I don't even know which one you're talking about, but I believe you.
There's this bit like around like 55th and like 13th in the U District where there's just this giant tree.
Oh yeah, is a tree that is blocking the sidewalk or lifting up.
Like there's this, like, the sidewalk's kind of actually, I think what it's caused, it's like there's basically this giant like depression in the sidewalk where there's always water and it's all busted up and you can basically have to go around. It's
cool. So I guess the best way to get involved.
Sorry, this is now turning into a rant about this one exact spot in Seattle that is just a pain to navigate through.
No, we have tons of people saying exactly the same kinds of things all the time, and so the best way to get involved directly with our group is to go to our website, which is opensidewalks.com, or email us at opensidewalks@gmail.com. And we're working on having the website have a better way to give you information on getting involved without having to talk to us. And then in terms of reporting issues, at the moment it's the same thing. We're building into our user-facing application, which is AccessMap, the ability to say, hey, I ran into a problem here, this area sucks, or something like that. But that's a work in progress at the moment.
I mean, the other feature is the other tricky bit is having a way to get those reports to city officials in an automated fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very important to try to integrate as much of this as possible. So at the moment, a lot of user-facing applications are kind of atomic, right? So like our AccessMap application, which is kind of like a Google Maps kind of thing, it basically just acts directly as a trip service request. But yeah, it would be much more value if we can integrate all these things together so that if you do notice a problem, you can report it to us. And of course, that would then get forwarded to officials depending on some process, as well as potentially be useful for advocacy. So it may be that officials are not necessarily responsive unless there's critical mass, like Manasi was saying. So it could also turn into something like a social media post or some kind of other organizational activity.
Huh.
And Manaswi, do you want to add anything, Manaswi, before we go, since you're also on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, there's also different kind of data collection from remotely if you cannot be in the physical space. So through Project Sidewalk, which is also another project, the same project that I'm part of, where you can survey streets on Street View and label issues if you want. And then we are slowly working with governments to take this data forward and help them make decisions around it. So that's another way of contributing to it, to the larger scale data collection.
Makes sense.
Awesome. Well, thank you again to all of our speakers. We are super over time, so I will let you all go now, but thank you so much for joining us. These are amazing talks. I'm super honored to have been here for it. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day. See you next week.